There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean. Welcome back to my channel, newly renamed Sean Breathes Books. It won't be too much longer before I don't need to say that anymore, but recently renamed my channel. But anyway, I am in one of the best moods I've been in a long time. Why? I got big news yesterday. Kenji's immigration application for permanent residency status that has been in the works for 2 years was finally approved yesterday. So it's all done. He's got about 2 more very small little things he's got to do. Get some updated passport photographs and stuff. But it's done. It's approved. So now we just have to wait because his mother is dying in hospital. And so he's obviously not going to come until that's all over with. And if I say anything else about that, I would end up getting struck by lightning. But that's the last thing that we're waiting for. The legality of it all. That he's my husband and is entitled to live in Canada on a permanent basis is all taken care of. So, yay! He was pretty excited. I wasn't going to announce it on my Friday reads because I hadn't gotten a hold of him, but he called me back at 1:30 in the morning, my time, this morning, and I was still awake. So, it was lovely to see the look on his face when I told him the news. So, he will be here when everything else sorts itself out, shall we say. All right, that's all my news, but that's pretty big, pretty fantastic news. So let's go directly to this week's fascinating mystery guest. And this week's mystery guest is Brad Bigelow, joining us from Montana. And Brad is all about the off-the-beaten-track books. He's got a blog. He's involved in bringing a lot of these forgotten gems back into print. And he's got a book club, among many other ways that he's keeping the obscure books, bringing them back to life and bringing them back into our consciousness. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you, Sean. Nice to be here.
You're very famous in my little corner of bookish booktube. So bookish Twitter, I should say. Bookish Twitter.
Get a bigger corner, Sean, please.
No. And in fact, you're kind of my role model. No, the more I've learned about you preparing for this chat, my reading tastes go towards the books that I've never heard of, the books that are out of print, and I read a lot of other stuff too. But I'm always drawn to the more obscure ones. And you've been passionately engaged in this corner of the reading life for a long time.
Yep.
In fact, you were written up in the New Yorker, so I really feel like I should ask you for your autograph.
I should specify that was the New Yorker website, not the magazine. So I didn't quite make.
We didn't need to mention that. It's still pretty darned impressive.
Yeah.
And that was about 8 years ago. And there's a quote you gave, if you were quoted correctly, that I just love, and it's a good way to get this chat started. You said, "It can be just a series of almost random things that can make the difference between something being remembered or something being forgotten." And then the journalist writes about what you're doing on your blog and so on that you've written about at that time. I'm sure the number is way beyond that now, about 700 books that had fallen into obscurity. And then this next quote of yours: "It's one little step against entropy, against the breakdown of everything into chaos." So, with that on the table, please tell us more about what you're up to.
When I was an undergraduate in college at the University of Washington in Seattle, I would usually study in the Suzzallo Library, which is a huge, beautiful library on campus. And the University of Washington Library is one of the biggest libraries in the world, it turns out, with millions of volumes. And so it's a great collection. And I would take breaks and just wander up and down the stacks and kind of pull books out and discover things that I didn't know about. I was taking a degree in English literature in addition to one on math because I was getting paid. I had a scholarship to get one on math, but I loved English, so I squeezed that in. I started to find these books that nobody had written about. Probably the first one that I came across was a novel about World War I called Other Ranks by a guy named W.V. Tilsley, Bill Tilsley. It's published in like 33, 34. got a couple of reviews, went out of print and disappeared. And I think it's one of the best books about, or novels about World War One ever published. And I loved it so much that I went up to the copy center and copied the whole darn thing. And I toted this Xerox of the novel around for many years before I was able to find a copy, which even then would cost, I mean, they were incredibly scarce, and it cost like 150 pounds to get the book. It's since been reissued. It was reissued, I think, in 2019, kind of as a labor of love by somebody who was related to one of the characters in the book. So it was very sort of autobiographical, very much the experience that Bill Tilsley had during or Vince Tilsley, I think it was how his family used to know him. Anyway, it was a terrific book, and a few kind of cognoscentes of World War One literature knew about it, and so it wasn't completely unknown, but it was off the map. So like Paul Fussell wrote this very famous book called The Great War in Modern Memory, which is a study of World War One literature that came out in the late 70s. Not mentioned there, not mentioned I can guarantee it's simply not mentioned in anybody's study of World War One literature. And that kind of tipped me off to the fact that simply because a book wasn't something that was getting written about or wasn't known didn't mean it wasn't a good book. So I became interested in that. And I from that point on, I was kind of always on the lookout for stuff that wasn't well known. Now, there have been a number of good kind of books about unknown books that have come out over the years. David Madden, who is still with us as a scholar of American literature, as well as a novelist in his own right. He published a couple of collections in the 70s called Rediscoveries that were writers writing about kind of their favorite unknown books. And there's been a couple of other collections like that. I think there was one called Lost Classics came out in the early part of this century. So, I mean, it's not an unknown subject. And from my experience, you ask any writer, and they will always have a handful of kind of their favorite unknown books. And to be honest, one of the things I will always say is that I got into this partly because I had nothing original to say about Virginia Woolf or James Joyce or William Faulkner. I mean, I felt like there were enough people saying and writing about the writers who are in the canon that somebody needed to go look into the ones that didn't get recorded. So that had been my hobby kind of all my adult life. In 2006, I started Neglected Books. I figured it would last for a couple of years and I'd run out of books. And now I know that it'll never come to an end.
Infinite supply.
I'm constantly coming across good stuff that it just fell off the map.
And one book like that, you mentioned David Madden and other people have put out books about forgotten books and forgotten authors. The one that I read, and it really influenced my reading for several years, and I have a bunch more books that I found out about in that book on my shelf, still waiting to be read. It came out about 5 years ago. The Book of Forgotten Authors by Christopher Fowler. That's from the UK.
Christopher Fowler did a great series for The Independent in the
UK.
Did he?
Okay.
So that book, I think there's actually two collections of his. He was doing like a weekly article about writers who fell out of print. Sadly, Christopher, he died of cancer last year.
Yes.
Because he was actually going to contribute to the introduction to one of the books that we've brought out for Orley House Press.
So in that New Yorker article from 8 years ago, you had written up about 700 forgotten books or neglected books. What have you been keeping a tally up to? Where are you up? What are you up to now?
I didn't keep a tally. It's amazing. I still don't know how I did it because I had a full-time job and this was just kind of my hobby I did on the weekends was writing about these things. And I was pretty good about doing one article a week, not keeping up that discipline in this last year because I have a number of other things keeping me busy. So I don't know what the number is. I don't keep track of it. I can tell you I am surrounded by stacks of my TBR. I don't have a TBR stack. I have a TBR room.
Yes, me too.
I would say a lot more of my interest has become in the writers and their lives as well as the
Yeah.
books. So kind of why, what happened in their lives, what led to their stuff becoming less known. So the work has become has sort of grown. I've done a bunch of Wikipedia articles about forgotten writers in particular.
And then somewhere along the line, you got involved with Boiler Press. And so you are actively working to bring a lot of these books back into print. Tell us about that.
Right. Yeah, it's Boiler House Press
Boiler House
in
Press.
the UK. I retired from NATO in 2019, and my wife and I moved we were in Belgium, and we moved to the UK to take the master's in biography and creative nonfiction at the
Oh, wow.
University of East Anglia. And that was great. It was a great course. I'm finishing up a book right now, and I certainly wouldn't be doing that if it hadn't been for the UEA program. But we got stuck there because of COVID. And so when I finished my dissertation, I contacted the publisher because I'd taken a seminar in publishing and said, hey, I'm here. Anything I can be helping with in terms of virtual working, I'm happy to do it. The press had taken over a series called Beyond Criticism from Bloomsbury, and kind of had four books that were the manuscripts were done and accepted, but they weren't getting published. And so I worked with the authors and got that series started. And in that experience, I was learning about ebooks and print on demand and all sorts of stuff like that. And I reached out to the publisher and I said, I know this one book. It's in public domain because the author never renewed his copyright. It's been out of print since 1937. It's this book called Gentleman Overboard.
Yep.
Here's a first edition of it. And I said, would you be interested in publishing it? And he came back and said, well, I know what you're interested in. Why don't you propose doing a whole series? So I leaped at that. That was a dream opportunity for me. So we put the series together. Our first book published was Gentleman Overboard, which came out in November of 21. And we've been doing about four books a year since then.
And what's the name of the series?
It's called the Recovered Book Series.
The Recovered Book Series. Man Overboard. Who's the author of that?
Yeah, it's Gentleman Overboard is by American writer named Herbert Clyde Lewis. That has by far been our bestseller. What's been interesting is the book has really taken off in other languages. In fact, I would love to see American and Canadian readers latch on to the book as well. We've sold more copies of the book in Germany than we have in the US. And that's because a German translation came out. Since we published the book, there have been about 7 or 8 translations come out. So the book is now available in French, Dutch, 2 Spanish translations, Portuguese, Italian, German, and Turkish. So
Wow.
the Turkish one came out a couple of months ago, and there's an Arabic translation due out later this year.
That must just be so incredibly satisfying. Wonderful feeling.
I mean, it's a book I've always loved, and it's an amazing little story about a man who falls off a ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The amazing thing about that is that it's been something that people respond to. It's sort of an existential story. And to see that come back has been, yeah, very satisfying. The writer's son, Michael Lewis, is still alive, and he had never expected that, he knew his father was a writer, but he never expected to see that book come back. So yeah, it's been satisfying in the sense that I was contacted by a publisher in Buenos Aires in 2009, I think, saying, hey, we're just interested. We like your blog and we're interested in kind of bringing back Spanish translations of some neglected books. Do you have any you'd recommend? And it was really just off the top of my head. I named Gentleman Overboard because the prose is quite clean. The story is sort of like not full of time-specific aspects. And so I thought it would translate well. I mean, it became their bestseller. It was translated, actually, that right after that was translated into Hebrew, and it sold like 4,000 copies in Israel, which is remarkable for a piece of recovered literary fiction. So yeah, it's been satisfying to see that some of my critical instincts are not completely off base.
That's amazing. And in fact, that book, Gentleman Overboard, has already been promoted on my channel by
Okay.
James Morrison. James Morrison was a guest on my channel to talk about one of the books he'd read, and that was the book. So yeah, I look forward to eventually reading it myself. Now, you've already talked about so many interesting things that we could, I feel like I could talk to you about all the things you've already mentioned for hours, but two questions. One is, what was your dissertation topic? And the second one is, what biography are you working on currently?
Well, the answer to both of those things is the same thing,
Same
which is
thing.
so yeah, I had a couple of different projects started for my dissertation, and then COVID hit and the archives got locked up. And so I had to shift to something that I could write about virtually. And I happened to stumble, written a very short thing, a classroom assignment about an American woman named Virginia Faulkner, who was sort of like a Dorothy Parker-like character. She was a little bit younger than Dorothy Parker, but she wrote several comic novels, lots of magazine fiction. She was a very clever woman. I'd read and written about one of her books, and so I kind of looked into her life for this assignment. And what struck me was that here she is doing all this stuff in New York and Hollywood, and then suddenly the next thing I find, she's an editor for the University of Nebraska Press in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I thought, well, that's a strange turn. And I happened to get connected with somebody who had copied a lot of her personal correspondence, and she shared it with me. And I ended up writing my dissertation about just an episode or two of Virginia Faulkner's life. Got to know somebody who actually had known her. She died in 1980, so there weren't a lot of people around, still around, who knew her. Got an invitation to submit a proposal to the University of Nebraska Press. I mean, that's where she was an editor, so it's not surprising that they'd be interested. So that's the book that I'm literally finishing up any day now and sending off to the press, is Virginia Faulkner, A Life in Two Acts, which is about how she had this success in New York and Hollywood, and then ended up for a variety of reasons, kind of having a midlife career crisis, and moved back to Lincoln, Nebraska, and became instrumental in resurrecting the critical reputation of Willa Cather. And she was very
Oh,
involved in
wow.
bringing a lot of Willa Cather's work back to print.
Sounds like a fascinating life. When do you think it will come out?
Next year sometime.
Yeah, great. Well, I might want to have you back to talk about that in more detail then. Now, tell us about the Wafer Thin Books book club.
James Morrison, who you've had on the show before, who writes as Caustic Cover Critic, and he and I have been in touch with each other for years. And he has published a couple of long lists of short books, well, we had to debate about what we would do, but we kind of picked 150 pages as an arbitrary number and said, well, let's work together this year and do a reading group where each month we would look at what we call a wafer thin book from that little skit on Monty Python. We wanted to have a range of time, so we've got everything from, I think the earliest is Heinrich von Kleist's Michael Kohlhaas, which will be later this year. That was probably early, like 1805, 1810-ish, up to relatively current, and also hit different continents, different languages, different time frames. And so we agreed on 12 books, and I put together a little website to help folks go through that. And for me, I've liked it because this year, trying to get my own book done, my capacity to read long stuff has been diminished. it's nice to pick up a book and know I'll have this finished in a day or two.
Sometimes less is more. Some of the most impactful books that I've read have been very, very short. Absolutely. So the link,
There's a wealth of them. I've been like a kid in a candy store finding these things. I don't do a lot of reading of contemporary literature because I have to if I'm reading in a book that's out of print, I'm not reading a book that's in print. And although I do a lot of listening on audiobooks, but anyway, it gives me a chance to catch up with a lot of literature that's a little bit more current because it's in a smaller package, so to speak.
so links to all of these places, the neglectedbooks.com, the Wafer Thin Books Club, and Boiler Press, and all of those things will be linked. And I and a good bookish friend of mine, Joe, we are taking part in the October discussion of Panthers in the Museum of Fire by Jen Craig. We both have got
That's
the book
right.
in
Yeah, we're
hand.
very lucky. Jen Craig has agreed to join us for that discussion
Wonderful.
because we're doing a time frame so that folks in Australia, the ones I've done up to the last 2 years, we did it so we could have people in the evening in the UK and people midday here in the US. We switched this one so it's morning for the folks in Australia and evening for us here in the US.
When I do group chats with James, that's usually what I do too. Evenings for us.
Right.
Not too early in the morning. James is not a morning person.
I try to put out something of other books related to that. And I've been posting like once a day on social media to just kind of keep attention going to these things.
And I'm on an email list where you have these really extensive reviews and information about various books. So it's really quite fascinating. Brad, you are fascinating, and what you're doing is really valuable to me and a lot of other people watching. So thank you, and thank you so much for coming on my channel to tell us all about it.
Well, thank you. For wanting to talk about it. I'm glad I didn't get into model train sets because you know,
Well,
but
I am too,
let's
Brad.
face it,
I'm glad you
most
didn't.
folks aren't particularly interested in dusty old books, so I don't kid myself.
I, for one, am very interested in what you're up to, and I know that I am not alone. Thanks so much, Brad.
Thank you, Sean.
While I was editing that chat with Brad Bigelow, I checked that World War I novel that he mentioned. I bought the last copy that a certain online bookseller, who shall remain unnamed, I usually name them, but I'm not going to today, had a really inexpensive copy of the reprinted hardcover, so it's on its way to me. Other Ranks by William Vincent Tilsley. Go look at the roster of books being discussed this year for the Wafer Thin Reading Group. As I said there, I'm taking part with Joe Smith for the October selection, Panthers and the Museum of Fire by Jen Craig, but there's one every month, and you might find one that jumps out at you. So do check that out. And I've been a little bit more busy, back to normal, with getting videos out, in that I managed to at least get two, and one of them was a pretty long one. I got the book review of Wild Houses by Colin Barrett up, so you know I finished that. I'll be talking about that very briefly in today's Friday Reads. And so that video went up, and then also a chat from a couple months ago about Edith Wharton's novella. It's actually not a novella. Edith Wharton's short novel, Summer, from 1917. And that was a wonderful chat between Chris, Dorian, James, and myself, where I was the only one that didn't really like it, and so they all jumped on me in the most intellectually stimulating way possible, and they didn't quite convince me, but they certainly gave me things to chew on, and that was a great discussion. So if you're interested in hearing more about Edith Wharton's Summer, check that out. There's 50 minutes of the four of us holding forth thereupon. All right, so I've had a really fantastic reading week, and I finished 3, and I'm going to tell you about 2 that are in progress, which is something I usually don't do because I'm never ready when I might have space in the Friday Reads to do that, and I'm going to do it today, and I'll tell you about the one book I'm starting. So yes, I did finish Wild Houses by Colin Barrett, and I absolutely loved it. The one thing I forgot to say in my review, so this would be a little bit of extra commentary, the tone of it and the setting, or the kind of characters and their socioeconomic station in life really reminded me of Shaggy Bain and also Douglas Stewart's second novel, Young Mongol. So there was a real sense of the deep characterization of people from that socioeconomic class that was just profound and magnificently done. I wanted to mention that. But other than that, please check out my review. It's like 9 minutes long, and it is a book that I would say that if your sweet spot, if when people ask you, are you more of a plot reader or a character reader, you answer 50-50, this book is for you because it does both masterfully. Yesterday, I finished a book that I have been reading for an awfully long time and picked up the pace and read it and absolutely loved it. And that is the gay novel from the Italian-Canadian Montreal novelist Christopher DiRaddo, his second novel, The Family Way. Oh my god, so this was a much chunkier book than his first one. The problem that I had is I don't do well with reading projects that don't have a fixed end date, because it's, there was no special reason to finish it on a timely basis, so that ended up working in its benefit in that it was just a luxuriant, slow read. How slow? I went to mark on Goodreads that I finished it yesterday. I started it exactly a year before, right down to the day. So I read it over a full year, and Christopher has been patiently waiting for me to finish it because I want to have a long-form chat with him about his second novel and also his first one. Christopher was a mystery guest on my channel a few months ago, and I loved his first novel, The Geography of Pluto, and I want to talk to him about both books. Stay tuned for that video in the future, hopefully the near future. But this was, as I said about his first novel, his style seems so plain, but it's deceptively plain. His writing describes everything his characters do, from buttering a bagel to petting the cat to this and that, and it seems really mundane, and perhaps it is, but mundane in a powerful way. Can I put it that way? Because you get about 100 pages in and you suddenly realize that you are in these characters and you care so much, you're so deeply invested, and it's because the minutiae accumulates a sense of deep character work. I mean, it's not all minutiae, or it wouldn't, but it is an essential part of building really deep characters. So the protagonist and the first-person narrator is Paul, and he is pushing 40 when the novel opens. He has a much younger lover, Michael. I believe Michael's pushing 30, so about 10 years age difference. They've been together maybe 3 years, and Paul and Michael, but really it's Paul, has a circle of gay friends that form a web of community and friendship and really family. It's like his gay family of gay men who have relationships that many of which are short-lasting, and that's an important part of the story. But the other central premise at the opening of the novel is that his friends, Wendy and Eve, they're a lesbian couple. They want him to be the sperm donor so that they can have a kid. And he decides that he wants to do this, so they don't want a father. They'd like him to be kind of an uncle figure, to be, somewhat involved in the kid's life, but not really the father. That's not the role that they envision for him, and under those circumstances, he agrees to go for it, and so that plays itself out through the course of the novel. The parents of Paul and Michael also are characters in the novel, but also Paul and Michael are both so preoccupied with their parents and with wounds from childhood or problems in the parental relationships that take up a lot of emotional energy and make up a lot of the emotional material of this novel, and all of that was just so beautiful. And Paul was a really interesting character. I'm really looking forward to talking with Christopher about everything, and in particular the main character, the narrator, Paul, because he was a piece of work. He was fascinating, and the story is very moving. It's a big story with lots of characters and lots of stuff going on, and it moves from scene to scene and chapter to chapter with a sense of everything that these characters do, like I say, from buttering their toast to forgetting to wash the dishes, it all is in service to a grand, deeply poignant, and deeply affecting story. I absolutely loved it. I think you probably will too. Stay tuned for my long chat with the author, Christopher DiRaddo. The other one I finished, I haven't been reading for a year, but I have been reading it for about 5 months, I think. And that is My Friends by Hisham Matar. Came out early this year. I started reading it early this year. And remember, my New Year's resolution was I was going to read more new releases from the library. Well, it's not working out because I get them out. And if the only time sensitivity is I have to get it back by the due date, and typically new releases, they don't let you have them for too long, maybe one renewal, that I end up, if I'm a ways into them and enjoying them, then I end up buying it before I've even finished reading it. So it's not working out. But I'm glad I have this copy because this will be a strong contender for my top 5 reads of the year, if not my book of the year. This was one of the most lusciously literary and socially politically relevant masterpieces I've read in a long, long time. Hisham Matar was an American-born Libyan writer who has lived in London for decades. His protagonist, his first-person narrator, we meet as a young man in Benghazi who comes from a very tight-knit family, and then he goes to university in the UK, and I realize when I may have talked about this months ago, I may have said stuff that wasn't. I've only just today read what's on the synopsis. I hate reading what's on the synopsis, but I wanted to find out what I'm allowed to say. So I'm probably going to say less about the opening premise than I did before. But he and another Libyan university student who he hadn't known until he came to Edinburgh, to university, they go up to London, and something happens there that is horrific and is based on historical truth of I think it was the 1980s, which means that Khalid, our protagonist, and his friend can never go back to Libya. So they've done something that they're on a blacklist and they know they can never go back, and he doesn't want to compromise his family, Khalid, so he kind of pulls away from his family and doesn't explain for a long, long time what happened that made him unable to ever return home. And so it's this specter of living in exile, the trauma of growing up in a totalitarian regime in which your family is still, at the mercy of being back home, and it moves through decades to the Arab Spring and a bit beyond. It does so in a way that is not only focused on and concerning with those political challenges, but also how literature and writing and storytelling is threaded through all of those concerns, deepening them, perhaps in some ways assuaging them or clashing with them. So this is a book that's as much about reading and writing and authorship as it is all of those post-colonial, totalitarian Gaddafi Libya stuff. Like, the two are irrevocably intertwined in a way that made it just an incredibly intense and beautiful reading experience. It's a 5-star read. It's probably going to be on my top 5 list. I think there was something about it that was still a little bit cold and remote, which has to do with the character, the temperament of the main character, Khalid, that prevents me from saying it's one of the best books I've ever read, but it's so close to being one of the best books I've ever read, but there was just a little bit of distance the older the main character, Khalid grew up. So the other character that I'm just going to mention briefly is the Libyan writer, and before Khalid leaves Libya, he listens to a radio broadcast, it's the BBC Africa channel, where this unknown Libyan writer, Hisham, reads a short story that is actually quite anti-Gaddafi, but only symbolically. Like, you have to kind of pay attention to what the story is to get the allegory or whatever, that sets off a chain of revelations for Khalid, and then years later he ends up meeting Hisham, so he becomes another central character. So there's the 3 men. Khalid is our narrator, Mustafa is the young man who he goes from Edinburgh to London with, and this terrible thing happens. And then Hisham is the the Libyan writer. And the way their lives intertwine is just incredibly rich. So it's a book about friendship, family, politics, ideological commitment, and its complications, literature. I just loved it. This morning I watched Eric R. Anderson's review. I knew it was going to be the first thing I watched after I finished the book. And he does a video kind of vlog tour of London, all the various parts of London that are that the scenes of this book are set in. And that's maybe the last thing I'll say. London itself is also a main character, and the ironical way that it plays out in the lives of these Libyan exiles. Oh my God, what an incredible achievement. I think if it's not on the Booker list, I'm going to have a conniption. So those are the two that I finished. I'm going to tell you about two that are in progress. And one is, and this also gives me a chance to remind you that there is a read-along going on. I'm really co-hosting it or whatever in name only. This is the second or third time I've mentioned it on my channel. And beyond that, it was based on an old idea I had that didn't go anywhere, and then Chris and Emily of the Booklookers took it and made it a manageable project. And it is in memory of Jenny Colvin, who was the host of Reading Envy, that wonderful book podcast, for many years until she died at the age of 39, quite shockingly, suddenly. This May was the 2-year anniversary of her passing, and her birthday was in July, so we're having a read-along of anything you can find on Jenny Colvin's Goodreads, and you've got thousands of choices there. So the one that I am reading and have now got a ways into is Rose Tremain's Music and Silence, and this is turning out to be absolutely wonderful. I'm doing it exclusively on audio. I seem to, maybe just with everything that's gone on in my life personally over the last 6 months or whatever, I'm now in a space where I can really concentrate on an audiobook. So I'm doing it on audio and having such a rich experience with the audio. There's two versions of the audio. One is an abridged. Why would anyone ever listen to an abridged audiobook? That's disgusting. It's immoral. But you have to really hunt for the unabridged, and I found it. On Apple Books, that's where I found it. I think that's the only place I could find it at all. But this is a novel set back in history. It is not a historical novel, because historical novels are just cheap genre fiction that have no space, I have no time for. Set in the early 17th century, and as I think I mentioned before, an English lutenist, Peter, comes to the Danish court to join King Christian IV Royal Orchestra. And he's really hot, and I'm not far enough into it to know if the old King Christian has the hots for him, but he certainly has taken a shine to him. And the king has insomnia, so just where I've gotten up to, he wants this gorgeous young English lutenist to watch over him while he sleeps, because not to play the lute, but just to watch over him. So that's where I've got up to. But then there's all these other characters that I'm not even sure how they are all going to connect. But the king's second wife is a piece of work, and she is having an affair with somebody else and really can hardly stand her husband, the old king. There's characters in Ireland that I'm assuming are all going to connect up with what's going on in Denmark eventually, but the character work is also really deep, and it's just already a rich tapestry of characters that I wonder how they're going to interrelate eventually. And music is obvious with the lutenist, and so he gets to the castle and he finds out that the orchestra, they have to be in the cold, unheated basement next to a bunch of hens and where they do the cooking or whatever, and so that their music can be piped up to the king at a moment's notice. That's where they play in the palace, and it's really, really cold and damp. That part is fascinating and weird, and apparently based on historical fact. I haven't done much historical research on it, but I assume it is. And that's all I'm going to say, but it's a book that has been on my shelf for a long time, and now that I'm as far into it as I am, which is about 10% or 15%, I think it's going to be a real hit. And speaking of real hits, I have now read not only the first two stories in Sharon Butala's most recent short story collection, Season of Fury and Wonder, but the stories that they are bouncing off of, that Sharon Butala wrote them in homage to. So those are Actually, it's 3. We started out of sequence, so I have read the one that's based on Hills Like White Elephants by Hemingway, and then Sharon's story Elephants, and then Raymond Carver's What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, which is paired with Sharon's What Else We Talk About When We Talk About Love. And now just getting started on reading Alan Silito's The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner, which was a story that I previewed in my most recent library book vlog. So glad to be getting back to that, and we'll actually finish the story, and then we'll read the companion story in here. But I have to say that Sharon Butala's story, What Else We Talk About When We Talk About Love, strong contender for my short story of the year. The voice in that story of an elderly woman whose sister and brother-in-law, also elderly, living in another Canadian city, are both dying of cancer, but the brother-in-law is going to die first, so she has never loved the brother-in-law. He was annoying, and he was never well liked by his in-laws, but she has to go and see him on his deathbed, or not his deathbed, but he's basically bedridden, and her sister isn't well, but her brother-in-law is gonna not long for this world, and she is full of conflict about, should she pretend she really cares about this guy, and how is she going to manage it, and all of that is done with so much of that older lady humor that can be quite biting and sarcastic, but there's layers underneath it. That is why I'm usually so drawn to characters who are older women, and she just nails it. She not only nails it, it was just an absolute delight to read, and then it ends in a shockingly moving way. So that's the best work of fiction I've ever read by Sharon Butala, that short story. And so this one is starting out wonderfully. I'm reading it to Mary Jean, and we're having a really good time with it. So that's what's in progress. So very quickly, I'm going to start this gay novel. This is an arc of Anyone's Ghost by August Thompson, and it comes out in early July, I believe. My friend Bernie of Bernie Lombardi fame on Bookstagram asked me if I'd be interested in getting a copy of it, because he was approached by the publisher, Penguin. And I said sure, so they sent me one, and I'm pretty sure Bernie and I are going to have a Zoom chat about it that will go up on my channel on the publication day, so which means I've got my reading cut out for me, but I'm looking forward to it. A relationship between two young men in rural New England. And I don't know the setting. I assume it's contemporary, but I'll know more soon, and excited to give it a try. So, an absolutely splendid reading week. I hope yours has been too. Thanks for watching.